Thanks everyone for joining us today on another edition of the Dimension Fold YouTube channel. And today we have a special guest, Mary Joyce, who is the author of several books. And I'll ask Mary to maybe tell us a little bit about your books now, Mary.
Well, Ken, you and I seem to have similar interests. I've written a book about Cherokee Little People, and that's a bit of history. I've written about UFOs. I guess I should give you titles. Cherokee Little People Were Real is the book we'll probably be jumping off from on your show today. I've written a book about secret underground military bases underneath the North Carolina mountains. I've written about Bigfoot, and these are stories where you get to find out there's a more human side to Bigfoot. It's not just the big monster in the woods. They have families and a lot of good things like that. So that one's Bigfoot. Beyond the footprints, and then I have one tangible evidence of Jesus, and cool. So those are the four that are in print right now.
Okay,
and of course they're all available with Amazon.
Right. So that gives us a lot to talk about. So we might have to do several sessions, but let's just see where we get to. So I wanted to talk to you firstly about the little people, because that's not really anything that I'm familiar with. I haven't really heard much about that. I know I've heard stories of, indigenous peoples having legends about giants. And of course, many of us have heard about the Lovelock Caves is that in Nevada or New Mexico?
Well, it's along the Grand Canyon.
Yeah, it? Okay. Yeah, so like out west, we hear a lot about giants, and I know there were a lot of stories about giants from the eastern states as well, especially as the settlers were coming through, and the Smithsonian Museum seemed to be scooping up a lot of evidence. But yeah, I must say this is kind of the first I've heard about little people. So I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say about that.
I was once in your shoes. Before I moved to Western North Carolina, which is mountainous, I'd never heard of Cherokee Little People. And I just kind of blew it off as mythology, stories around campfires. And then one day I got to meet an elderly man who was well respected in the community. And after World War II, as a young man, he had helped do some of the construction at Western Carolina University, which is here in the North Carolina mountains. And he said, no, they're real. And when they were building this campus, no matter where they would dig to create a new building or put in a sewer system or put in a new stadium, they were finding these little tunnels. And they were, let's say 2.5 feet across and about 3.5 feet tall. And they were square cut, except for the top, and the top was rounded, which makes the tunnels more sturdy. And then some of the men that I talked to, they had just been involved with all sorts of construction at that time. And one of the bulldozer guys had scooped up an old skeleton, and it was a child-sized skeleton, except the skull itself had wisdom teeth, which, you have to be, at least 18 to start hatching wisdom teeth. Right. And this one professor kept it on his desk as a conversation piece. He always said it was just a Cherokee child skull. And it was actually an English teacher from the high school who picked it up and looked at it and said, no, this has all its wisdom teeth. It can't be a child skull. Right. So that's kind of how it started. And to be quite honest, I never would have gotten these stories if I hadn't had a connection with this particular old timer, who then introduced me to other old timers who were involved in the construction. And so for about a year, I would spend Saturdays around kitchen tables interviewing these old timers. And the reason I did it was because there was nothing recorded about it, absolutely nowhere. And I wouldn't have written the book, except I knew this needed to be preserved. And at first I just did it as an academic thing, but then I got more and more information, and the book actually has a lot of photos, a lot of maps, location maps, and of course the interviews. So it just proved to be a very, very interesting thing. And since then, well, I shouldn't jump too far ahead, but I thought you might find that interesting. We also have had legends of giants in this area, and Bigfoot in this area, and UFOs in this area. So when I moved here, I moved into what I would call a hotspot.
Yeah. Okay. So what's the Cherokee connection? Were there Cherokee legends that coincided with these findings that would explain these things?
The Cherokee are originally from the Great Lakes region, and they moved here to the mountains. I don't really know how long ago, but a long time ago. When they first moved here, they would see these little gardens, vegetable gardens, but they didn't see any people around. And then somebody at night noticed that these little people came out from underneath the ground, collected their vegetables and took them out underneath the ground. And originally the Cherokee called them the moon people because they came out at night. But now they're known as the Cherokee Little People because we do have the Cherokee Indian Reservation here. So that's how it all connects. We have a big soup of unusual things in this very condensed area.
Huh, that's very interesting. So the Cherokee were basically saying that they saw them, like, and this might have been a couple hundred years ago, or maybe 1,000 years ago, do you figure? Or?
Well, this has been a continuing learning process for me because I thought it was only in the past. And the title of the book is Cherokee Little People Were Real. But when the Cherokee found out I wasn't going to laugh at them because I was taking a serious slant on this subject, I began to hear stories about little people still living in remote areas in this part of the country. And I think it was about 17 years after I did all this initial research, I finally saw a photo of one. Now it's not a clear one. Some people that I know who live on one of the ridges here had a webcam or a game cam set up, and they live up at the top of a ridge, single gravel lane road, and they caught this little creature off in the distance. And the husband and wife debated between themselves if they should share it with me. One of them thought it was a spirit. The other one thought it was real. And so when they finally shared it with me, I put it on the computer and I turned up the contrast really high. Now, anything that's alive will go into the magenta range. Anything that's a ghost will stay white. And so on the website, I actually showed the different kinds of pictures. There's one old picture where there is a ghost playing with a child on the floor. The child goes to magenta and the ghost stays white. Well, the little creature in the woods went to magenta, which meant it was alive. Now, this was done, captured in August. It was really hot. And we saw the backside of this little guy. He had long, straight cut black hair and was pretty much nude. He may have had something on the bottom, but it wasn't real clear. So they went, measured where his head had come on the tree behind where he showed up. And he was about 3.5 feet tall, 3.5 feet tall. And that's what I consistently hear from people who have either found the bones or actually seen the little creatures.
Wow.
And I got some really interesting witnesses. For example, I told you that these men that I interviewed were primarily involved with construction projects at the university. Well, to make it doubly interesting, many of them had grown up in this area. And a couple of the guys, when they were little boys, used to hide their cigarettes in the basement. They would go through the janitor's closet. And then behind there were 3 of these old tunnels that were still under the McKee building, which is one of the oldest buildings on the campus. And they were little at that point, and they would peek into them, but they wouldn't explore it any further because they thought it was spooky. But those same men grew up to do the construction, and they also told me stories of when they were children. There used to be what they thought was an Indian mound. Well, this Indian mound had a tubular hole straight down in the center of it. And the farmer, according to these now grown men, used to put logs down into that hole so the cattle wouldn't fall into the hole. And so these construction guys said it wasn't an Indian mound. It was a pile of dirt from all these tunnels being dug, because they traced so many of the tunnels back to this, what they call a mound.
Right. Okay. So they would have been having to bring the dirt up and dump it.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Well, that would
something
indicate
to
that
dig a
it was
hole.
fairly recent then, right? There were ongoing excavation probably fairly recently.
Yeah, the camp, yes. During the time I've lived here, much of that construction has been done. Of course, it started back at World War II, and I do not have memories of that at all. But these gentlemen did. And like I said, I'm so glad that I interviewed them, because they've all passed away now. And if I hadn't done those interviews, it wouldn't have been preserved.
Right. And so those guys were Caucasian immigrants who were working in the construction industry, but you also spoke to a couple of Cherokee elders as well.
One of the gals that I talked to who lived during that time was the great granddaughter of Solly, who is one of the hero type chiefs for the Cherokee. And she told me that all the Cherokee believed in the Little People. Many of them had seen them. And she was of the belief that they originated from the stars. Now, that's not so peculiar, because the Cherokee people believe that they came from the Pleiades. And many of their creation stories or origination stories are woven into stories about the seven sisters. The seven sisters are the seven stars in the Pleiades. So it's the Cherokee are very open to the idea that both they and the Little People have come from the stars.
Right. And with that theme pops up in a lot of legends from all different kinds of cultures all over the world, with various, degrees of how seriously, well, I don't know how to even say it, but yeah, it keeps popping up, and you got to wonder, right?
You got to wonder. I'm convinced now. I went from not knowing a thing about it to now believing that not only were they real, but there are still some around, not in large numbers, obviously. But we have Bigfoot in this area, and they can hide out really well. So imagine how much easier it is for a little person.
Right.
Going back to these old timers, one of them, when he was 5 years old, there was a major flood of the Tuckasegee River, which goes through this area. And he found what he called a lead head. It was a very heavy metal oval, a little bit more than, well, maybe 1.25 inches in length. And it had like a leprechaun face on each side of it. And it had been washed out from whoever knows how long ago. And it had been molded. You could see the seam around the edge of it. And it had the pointed ears and the nose of a leprechaun. And in the book, I show it right next to one of the illustrations of a leprechaun to show you how similar it really is. And what's interesting is the Cherokee did not like the Little People that had red whiskers and squinty eyes, and they would try to kill them. And some of the moonshiners, again, we have a very interesting area here. Some of the moonshiners back in the 30s found a pile of little bones, and they didn't want their still to be discovered, so they just covered it up and pretty much kept quiet about it. One of those guys, who was almost 90 at the time, did take me back into the woods where this still had been. I was hoping to see some remnants of it. We couldn't find it, but at one time it was there.
Fascinating. So what do you make of that? I guess I'll call it a coin. I don't know if it's literally, not necessarily saying that it was used as money, but a coin-shaped object with images on the sides.
It wasn't exactly coin shaped. It was oval shaped like this, but it was kind of rounded on each side with this face emblazoned on each side. So it doesn't fit my definition of a coin.
Yeah,
More
okay.
like a medallion kind of thing. I don't know.
Right. An amulet.
I've never seen anything quite like it.
Did it have a hole in it?
Nope. Nope, it didn't.
Interesting. Could have been like some kind of good luck
Could have
item,
been.
or,
Could
you
have
know,
been.
who knows?
Another
Or
mystery,
even,
another mystery that's here is we have, it's the largest petroglyph in this state and one of the largest in the southeast. And one time I knew the dimensions, but let's say it's about 15 feet across and 10 feet this way, and it's at an angle. And it has all these markings on it that nobody has been able to make sense of. I mean, obviously, it was created by some intelligent being.
yeah.
But some people think it might have been the little people that did those, because the Cherokee can't figure it out.
Right.
So there's a lot of mysteries that still aren't solved.
Yeah, you know, it's funny that that seems to be a consistent thing wherever you go. If you're in North America, there's these stories that the indigenous people have some clues on, or have part of the story, but don't know the whole story. It's the same thing in South America when the Incan people, when the conquistadors came over, and basically, you know, it's a lot of bad things happened there, but there were a few of the Spaniards that were actually seeking to understand these people, and they would ask things about, like, you know, who made these temples, and where did all this gold come from, and stuff like that. And always the Inca people would reply that, well, it wasn't us. This stuff was already here
Right.
long before us. And even in Egypt, contrary to the popular opinion and the academic status quo, there is evidence of this break. It wasn't a continuous culture that simply evolved into what we see in the Egyptian, what do they call it, the dynastic periods, but rather there was a much earlier and somewhat disconnected tradition that they were aware of, and basically they referenced as like this was a whole other thing that happened before, and that's sometimes referred to as Zep Tepi, which is one of the original names in Egypt, for which means the before time. So seems to be a consistent thing. And, you know, I wonder how much of that information has morphed into some of the legends that are still carried on, or at least that the elders might be able to tap into.
It's real hard to find an elder who is really an elder anymore. You know, the real old ones who had lots of knowledge aren't living anymore. There's just a few of them who carry on the traditions. But the amazing thing is that when I found out that there are contemporary stories going on, and some of them are kind of cute. There's one Indian girl who was willing to talk to me only because we had a mutual friend that we both trusted. If we didn't have that connection, she never would have opened up with me. But she told me several little stories that are just kind of cute. Her family has a little trailer up in a remote part of the reservation, and they use that when they have family picnics and gatherings, and that becomes the cooking place and the restroom. And this gal, who when I met her was in her late 20s, when she was a child, they were playing hide and seek, and she went to hide in the shower of the RV, or the little cabin. And when she pulled back the curtain, there was a little man that she said looked like Mowgli from the Jungle Book, with straight flat cut hair like this, and he just made a big smile at her. And I think he just wanted to play with the kids, but it scared the you-know-what out of her, and she went, Daddy. But she told me two other stories besides that one. there's a part of Western North Carolina that is more remote than the reservation. And it's in the Robbinsville area, Snowbird area. And there are more full-blooded Cherokee that live there than on the reservation. And her aunt and uncle lived there. And
Okay.
her uncle, who speaks Cherokee and is very much into the culture, said he dusted flour all over the floor. And he said, wait till morning. And in the morning, there were these little footprints, which I have seen in the sand, which, you know, are like about that size. So she remembered that. And both her mother and her grandmother could remember playing in the woods in that area, and had come upon Little People. And I think it was her grandmother that said she'd only seen one female little person. For the most part, she'd only seen, you know, males or boys or whatever.
Okay. So they might have like a gender division of work type of thing where the males are going out hunting or exploring or whatever they're doing.
That still seems to be just a genetic thing all across the board, doesn't it?
Yeah.
In
Yeah.
fact, one guy who has little people living on his land, he said the ones that call the mischief are the male teenagers. And that's true of humans. Human teenagers are much more likely to be creating mischief. And he said sometimes one of them has been in a tree out in his woods. He has like 200 acres. And he said that they have swung down like this so that they're looking them right in the face by hanging from a limb. So, you know, there's playfulness with many of these stories.
Interesting.
But you got to remember that the Cherokee for so long were laughed at by the Caucasians, you know, just saying those stories are ridiculous. And like I said, I would not have had anybody sharing this with me if I hadn't proven that I believed that there really were Cherokee Little People. One man had also a Cherokee, and he told me the story of going hunting, and it had gotten a real stormy night. And so he and his buddy went into this cave just to wait out the storm. And during the night, his buddy woke him up and he said, listen. And there were at least two little people outside the door chatting with each other. And he said that they could understand some of the words, but that they were speaking like a really old-timey kind of Cherokee language, so they could only understand part of it. And in the morning, there were those little footprints in the mud. So those are the kind of stories that I get to hear.
That's really cool. Well, and this whole underground thing is really interesting because I mean, a lot of people who are into the Bigfoot stuff figure that the Bigfoot that the Sasquatch goes underground as well, which at first seems like that's ridiculous. How many, like, there's just not that many caves around, but really there's a lot of caves. There's even, like, I think really everywhere you go, there's actually kind of a lot of caves, but you just don't know that they're there. Where I am here, we do not have any kind of limestone formations, and it's mostly like granite and stuff like that. And yet, even though the geography is not really suitable for caves, there are still caves around. I know of a large cave formation maybe an hour or two away from here, and I could, in about a 10-minute drive, I could get to the closest cave that I know.
Where are you located?
I'm in the middle of British Columbia, up in Canada. So basically, it's very rugged territory, and we're in a city of about 80,000 people, and there's thousands and thousands of square miles of wilderness surrounding us. So absolutely, there could be easily millions of creatures hiding out in caves that we would never know about.
Right. I can give you one of my firsthand experiences. one of the men who's lived here all of his life. He's a younger man compared to the old timers. And he lives at the top of a ridge here in the mountains. And he has Bigfoot living on his land. And you go up to his place, it's a gravel road, single lane. And then he took me into the woods. He took a machete, not because he was fearful, but because we needed to cut a path to get to the cave. And it was a good sized cave where he knew that the Bigfoot hung out or would, take shelter. And when we started going into that woods, I heard this sound, and so did he. It sounded like a bird, but not quite like any bird you've ever heard. And then off in the distance where we were going, there was like an answer in that same kind of a bird call. And then everything got silent. Well, we saw 2 Bigfoot prints right about there. And when we ended up getting to the cave itself, it was pretty good size. It was flat cut like this, and probably 8 feet across and about 5 feet high. I took pictures of it, and I've included that in my Bigfoot book. I was not brave enough to go in. I could not see the back of the cave, and I simply was chicken.
Yeah. Well, you never know what you're going to run into in there. Even if there isn't any, even if there's no such thing as Bigfoot, there's definitely such thing as a bear.
And a panther.
Yeah, exactly.
Between the footprints and the strange bird call, which I've heard Bigfoot researchers tell me they have also heard, it was pretty convincing we were in their territory. Yeah. And it was remote. I mean, the average person's never going to see this. If this guy didn't have a machete and hadn't been hunting back in there, I would never have seen it.
Yeah. Well, okay. So, I mean, I'm pretty close to living in the bush. I live in the city right now, but a couple years ago, we were about probably 25 kilometers out and living by a lake, and there was very few people around. There's a couple hundred people who live around the lake, and then again just wilderness for miles. And even out there, like, we're definitely in animal territory. And you would see, you'd see moose, and you'd see deer, and you'd see some bear and a skunk or something. But even then, okay, you can count on your hands the number of times that you see them in a year. So even though they're there, you still don't see them. Right. And so I think the argument of, well, if there was Bigfoot, how come we're not seeing him? Well, the argument is invalid, because we know there's grizzly bears around, and I've never seen a grizzly bear. I've only seen black bears, but I know that there's grizzlies around. So yeah, I think it's fascinating that, like, we kind of jump to logical conclusions that that might not be founded. So when we're talking about, we've got little people, we've got Bigfoot, we've got giants. Maybe Bigfoot and giants are somehow related. They're both large, bipedal, seemingly humanoid, semi-intelligent at least, types of beings. What if the legends that we hear, now of course there's evidence on both sides as well. So we got little footprints, we've got big footprints, and then somewhere in the middle there's us. And then the stories that on both sides of those is that there are people who are smaller, there are people who are bigger. And I almost kind of wonder sometimes if some of those stories are actually talking about each other. So, like, even if we didn't have physical evidence, but we do, I mean, I think that there's a lot of really solid physical evidence, but I'll give you that some of it's probably fake. But even if there wasn't any physical evidence, we have stories that say, hey, we ran across some little people, and then another group is saying we ran across some big people. What if that's the same story being told from two different sides, where there's simply some kind of people, some of which are taller than the others, right?
I mean, I can give you a partial answer on that. is a researcher, a doctor, Melba Ketchum. And a number of years ago, she did a 5-year study on DNA evidence taken from Bigfoot, Bigfoot hair and blood and skin and all sorts of tissue.
Okay.
And after that 5-year study, she went public and said that the DNA for the Bigfoot was half human and half some unknown species. The human part shows up just shows up readily. The paternal part, or the daddy part, is only in the nuclear DNA, which is a little bit harder to get. And that's why sometimes the hair samples will just come up as human. If you don't have the root of the hair, which is where the nuclear DNA is, you will never find out about this paternal side. And that is totally not human. So there's been interbreeding, as far as I can see, between humans and some unknown species. At first, right. Dr. Ketchum was just maligned. The scientific community just said it was a bunch of crap. Since then, a number of other scientific researchers have confirmed her results. So we are dealing with something unique.
Right. Well, that's very interesting, because in the last 2 or 3 years only, really, it's been established in pretty much in mainstream science that the Homo sapiens is a combination of DNA from Neanderthal, Cro-Magnon, and Denisovan, and all of these other lineages, which we had up until very recently had always assumed they were completely different species. And it's really kind of makes us have to rethink our concept of what species even means, because I think that it's sort of a false idea. You think that, well, traditionally we were, I think, taught mostly that the species is 2 different animals, let's say, that cannot interbreed. Well, that's not even right, because they've successfully bred lions and tigers together, and
Right.
many other examples. So this whole concept is just like, I think we really just need to throw away that idea of species. It should go the same way as race, because there's no such thing as race, and neither is there anything as species. We're all people, we're all hominids, and we all have different, mixtures of DNA, but that DNA is always mixing through the gene pool.
Big
Yeah.
melting pot in more ways than people realize.
Yeah. Yeah. And even just the, we've got these things like 23andMe and other services that will do DNA analysis of you. And you provide a sample and they'll tell you where your ancestors come from. And when I did that, I was fascinated, because and this is typical for, I think, almost everybody who does it, is that you expect, because oh, my parents are from here, my grandparents are from here, blah blah blah, so you expect to see whatever 3 or 4 countries that you know about, but instead you see this wide range where, okay, maybe 80% of your DNA is from England or Holland or wherever you think you're from, but then there's like these little parts where like 1 or 5 or 10% is from, like, who knows where, some wildly place that you could never imagine that you had ancestry from. And that really indicates to me that over a long period of time, there's been a lot of travel. We have this concept that our ancestors were like simple farmers, and they just lived on their little piece of ground and never went anywhere. And that's just wrong, because there's no way for that DNA to move around unless the people are moving around. And there were adventurers and travelers and explorers and traders and merchants, and their DNA is just spread all over the world.
A good example of that is Otzi the Iceman. Do you know that? Well, anyhow,
Yeah.
his remains were found in the Alps, I think the French Alps.
Yep.
But all of his DNA said that he originated down in Sardinia, which is, down in the Italian area.
Oh yeah, yeah.
So that's a bit of a travel for that period of time.
Yeah. And he was at least 5,000. Like it was because
at least, yes.
they only found him because he was buried in a glacier that was now melting.
The one nice thing about global warming, and it's the only thing I can think of that's good,
Yeah.
is that a lot of our history is being revealed because things are melting quite quickly. And it's amazing what you can find using Google Earth. And Antarctica is melting faster than, or is warming faster than any place on Earth, because there's a whole volcanic chain underneath the western part of it. And so we found the ruins of ancient cities. All right, how old would those be? I mean,
yeah,
the continent's been covered in ice for like, millions of years.
Yeah.
So the ruins that are now being exposed are older than anything that we know anywhere else in the world. To me, that's exciting.
Right. I do not want to let that lead go by. So, but I think I'm going to need to see some pictures on that. Maybe
let me give you my website.
Yeah, I've looked at your website a little bit. Maybe send me a couple of specific pictures, and we can dig into that Antarctic thing later on
Okay.
another show. Okay, so let's see. So let's get into UFOs, because this probably ties in. So if the Cherokee and many other indigenous peoples are telling us that not only they came from the sky, but there's also other races and species, even though we just disproved that idea, that are also coming from space. So then, do those legends also contain stories of later visitations? Like, it's one thing to say, they came here and now we're here. But then I think another part of that story is they came here, now we're here, and they continue to come back, whether they're checking on us or doing further manipulation of the DNA, or like, who knows, right? It gets into all kinds of interesting and sometimes crazy theories, but I think that there's something to that. And so what are your thoughts on that, or what have you discovered on that front? Any kind of ties between those two?
I can answer several ways. One, the website I started to refer to is called Skyships Over Cachers.
Right.
That was because Cachers is a mountaintop town here in Western North Carolina. And the reason we named the website that was because we were seeing so many UFOs over Cachers,
Right.
and lots of them. But the website's gone way beyond that. If I had known that we would be going in so many different directions, I probably would have picked a different name. But it was because of UFOs. But again, in that same very small area, there are the UFOs, there are the Bigfoot, there are the little people, and the remnants of giants. And so it just opens up the imagination. And what can you do with all that information?
Yeah. Have you seen, in terms of your research, have you seen any anecdotal evidence that would say that, linking the sightings, like, okay, there was a UFO sighting this night, and also a Bigfoot sighting?
One story is coming to mind. It's here in North Carolina. It's a little bit further east than where I am, and there are Bigfoot there. And there's one guy who really is keeping on top of all of it. And one night he heard the Bigfoot making a lot of noise. Well, he took his camera out because if something was going on, he wanted to try to capture it. And the Bigfoot were along the wooded line, or the forest line.
Tree line.
We were all looking up at the sky. This is at night.
Oh, yeah.
And he looked up, and there was a gold UFO, and he was able to get a picture of it. So there were the Bigfoot looking right up at the UFO that was right above him. There's a connection between UFOs and Bigfoot. I have not made an absolute decision for myself how much significance there is there, but
Right.
they're both are phenomenal in the same area.
Yeah. Now, okay, so you've written books on both of those topics. Um, do you had in both of those fields, is there I've heard claims of, I guess, telepathic communication, both from Bigfoot, between Bigfoot, and also from the ETs. Got any ideas around that?
That seems to be the universal way of communicating. And people who are really sensitive even to their house cat or their house, their house dog, are able to do some degree of telepathic communication with their pets. So it shouldn't be, thought of as crazy that, that's the way much of the communication is. Let's face it, working with these words, they just get all tangled up, and we don't always express ourselves so well. So maybe telepathy is a much better way. But yeah, you hear that with the UFO contacts or the ET contacts. You hear it with Bigfoot. I do not know about the little people. I've never heard a story in that regard. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I just don't personally know that.
Yeah. Well. Oh, and the other thing I just thought of too. I was going to say something about this earlier, but in Indonesia, there is well documented archaeological evidence for a hominid species. Again, I'll use the species that was about 3 feet tall, and they go by the scientific name Homo floriensis, I believe it is.
I've read it. I've seen the word. I'm not going to try to say it for you because I'll mess up.
I'm pretty sure it's Homo floriensis, also known as Flores man, and also sometimes colloquial called the Hobbit. Of course, after J.R.R. Tolkien's fictional race. But it's quite interesting that, so we know for a fact that there were little people. The evidence on the giant side tends to be less accepted. I don't know of any mainstream academics who have yet come out and said, yeah, there definitely were giants. But I mean, obviously we have giants in every other species. We had giant horses, giant cattle, giant deer, giant pigs, like back during the not Pleistocene. I can't remember the name of the period, but during one of the geographic periods, North America was essentially overrun by all kinds of animals, and they were all gigantic. So if there were humanoid creatures, let's say, back then, you would expect that they also would have been giant.
Well, one of the things that I find quite annoying is the Smithsonian.
Yeah.
And I've read several books on it, and lots that have documented lots of old newspaper reports going back to primarily the 1800s, where they have found the remains of giants. They've called in the Smithsonian. One of their representatives shows up, they take it and they haul it back to the Smithsonian, and you never see it again. Well, right. The extent of these old newspaper reports spread out over the country in and of itself is convincing that they were finding these things. And I think it's quite regrettable that the Smithsonian is so secretive about it. They must have a vault down in the 3rd or 4th basement that they keep these things in. And locally, I was disappointed to hear from an anthropology student at Western Carolina University tell me that they had, and I heard this from several people, that they had 2 giant skeletons in the forensic storage area at Western Carolina University, and they had 6 toes. And I ran into one of these anthropology students at my other office, which is Dunkin' Donuts, and overheard her talking. And so I started a conversation with her, and she said that those skeletons, including the little people skeletons, had been turned over to the Smithsonian. I thought, oh, we're never going to see those again.
Why do people keep giving them stuff? Oh man, it's so frustrating. And you know, I've seen the same thing with these newspapers. I've seen literally hundreds of separate stories in newspapers, many of them with pictures, with like pretty convincing pictures, whether it be a giant femur or tibia or whatever. Usually a lot of times it's a leg bone, because those are the largest bone. And like so many of these, without even looking, I'm not even going looking for evidence of giants. This is just stuff that keeps coming across my trail. And I think you have to be, I don't know how anybody could just write all that off. Like, were newspapers really that
fanciful?
Yeah, and if they were, why were they still around? Like, why did anybody give them any credit, right? Like,
right.
I mean, you can ask the same question today, I suppose, if you look at any from Fox News to CNN. Either way you go, there's a lot of fake news, and there always has been. But I think that there's got to be a grain of truth in a lot of these stories.
I wish I could remember the title of the two books that I've read about the giants. They've all come out in fairly recent years, and they all are packed with copies of these old newspaper articles. Yeah. And there's just so many of them. It's just hard to blow it off. Actually,
I have a book right here that
I hope it's one of the ones I've read.
I don't know. This is a pretty new book. Let's see. Oh, of course. It's hard to get these to show up.
No, I have not read that one. No.
The Myth of Man by J.P. Robinson. I'll put a picture of it on screen. He goes into a whole bunch of different stuff. So one of the things he talks about is giants. Also another thing is out of place artifacts, and just a whole bunch of other topics. But there's actually a lot of people writing about that stuff. One of the guys who I think really cracked open a lot of that data is Michael Cremo, and his main
about this thick.
Yeah, it's 800 pages,
and it's written very academic. It's no easy read.
Yeah,
but yeah, he's covered a lot of territory.
Yeah. So I think that, it's really good that a lot of people, including these guys and yourself and myself, are really kind of cracking open some of the boundaries that these are things that we've been told that just really are not true. And it makes you wonder why they're telling us this stuff. So if you look at the Smithsonian as a good example, what's their motive for hiding the fact that there are giants? I can't even think of one. Like, if you think about, okay, a lot of times conspiracies are fueled by religious conservatism or something like that, but that doesn't add up in this case, because honestly,
there's giants in the Bible.
Exactly. So wouldn't it be good to prove that there were giants? Because then it gives the Bible more credibility.
Actually, if you really, really get into the Bible, there is quite a bit said about them being there. You just have to learn that some of these names were communities of giants. And the average person isn't going to know that unless they really...
Yeah, I'm actually writing a book on that as well. So even more fascinating than giants, there are communities of intelligent beings in the Bible that are aquatic. So I don't know if they're like dolphins or porpoises or something, or like, I don't know. But the really weird thing is, in Genesis 24, God blesses humankind and says, "May you be fruitful and multiply and inherit the earth." Before that happens to humans, God gives the same blessing to one of these other races or species or whatever that are seemingly some kind of mammalian aquatic creature, and he blesses them and gives them this exact same blessing. May you be fruitful and multiply. That's the only 2 times that that happens anywhere in the Bible. And so humans are not the first, and it's very clearly stated in the Bible. We just overlook it, brush it under the rug.
Tell me, can you pull it off the top of your head? Where is the water?
Well,
creature?
okay, so this requires a little bit of retranslating from the Hebrew, because the Hebrew uses a lot of these words that end in im. So you have Elohim, you have Anasim, you have the Menayahim, and these are all groups of, they're people, but they're not human people. Like the Elohim, we know are not humans, because that usually gets translated as God, but it's a plural word, so it's the gods.
The gods.
And a lot of these words are extremely badly translated. For example, there's one called the Mayim, which is basically the people. They're a people. They end in im. But what we translate it into in every translation that I've ever seen is the sky, or sometimes the clouds, but it's not the sky, it's the sky people, because they're clearly people, but the first part of the word mai, does seem to indicate sky. So the translation is sort of right, because it gets sort of part of the idea in terms of sky or water in some other cases, but it always leaves off the fact that it's the people of the sky. So when he went to the sky, he went to the people of the sky. And there's about I'm collecting words that end in im, and I'm studying all of these Hebrew words and trying to make sense of it. So I still have a lot of work to do on that front, but it's becoming very clear that there are a lot of these other species that are intelligent, and the Bible straight up tells us about it, but we have gone out of our way to mistranslate and miscommunicate and completely take it out of what it's actually trying to tell us. Just the fact that we read the book of Genesis as a single creation story is completely crazy. It's like it's easy to say that there's 3 stories back to back that are separated. They don't jive between each other. And there's evidence for up to 6 or 7 completely different stories. So it's not just one story. It's several stories, and if by reading them as separate and unique stories, you actually get a lot of nuance that completely disappears when you read it as a single narrative, which it was never intended to be.
When you get done with that book, let me know.
Absolutely, I will. It's all in the first few chapters of Genesis. Right now, there's other stuff too. I'm digging into the book of Job, which has quite a bit of stuff in related to that. But yeah, a lot of it is, if you start reading the book of Genesis with a Hebrew interlinear edition, which you can get online, or you can buy at a Bible store. It's fascinating because once you start looking into it, I'm just blowing my mind as to how many words are just wrong. And again, it's like the Smithsonian thing. And it's the same type of thing as Egyptology, where it's just like, this is the way it is. And no, it's not like that at all. Like, I don't know if you're into Egyptology at all.
I know that the guy who's in charge of it in Egypt is very straight-laced in his beliefs, and he cuts off a lot of, I don't know, investigations because he
Yeah.
has such a belligerent attitude about how he thinks that everything was constructed.
Yes, exactly. Now, thank God, I believe that guy is retired, but it hasn't really gotten much better. It's hard to say, especially now, like with with the lockdowns in the last few years. But even in the last 6 months, I'm aware of a bit more openness in terms of letting investigators go. A couple of the investigators that I follow on YouTube have actually been able to go right inside some of the pyramids and have had access to areas that have been closed for decades. So
Right.
I have a little bit of optimism on that front, but it's quite fascinating how just the standard explanations are just accepted without any kind of question, even though they make no sense at all. Like the pyramid's not a tomb. There's never been a body found inside in any pyramid.
That's
So
true.
where did this idea come from? And yet that's what they teach us in grade 6.
Right.
Like, it's crazy.
I agree with you.
Well, thanks a lot, Mary, for joining us today. It's been a very interesting conversation and a pleasure talking to you. I know that we'll probably talk more in the future, but until we see you again, where can we find your books online?
All of the books are available on Amazon. Again, the titles are Cherokee Little People Were Real, Underground Bases Hidden in North Carolina Mountains, Bigfoot Beyond the Footprints, and Tangible Evidence of Jesus. And like I said, they're all on Amazon. And my website, where I update it just about every week, we do a lot of different subjects. And that website is skyshipsovercashiers.com. Cashiers is spelled just like a cashier at the grocery store.
Great. I'll put a link underneath this video. Okay, thanks a lot. And thanks everyone for listening. And please don't forget to like and subscribe and check out our sponsors as well. Thanks a lot. We'll see you next time. Please visit our sponsor, neandertees.com, fashion for the discriminating Neanderthal.